Well, hello, hello. How are you guys doing? The Holy Bible has a story for you today. We're going to talk about fish vomit. I don't know if that's what you're expecting. I'm getting a little ahead of myself. We're in the book of Jonah. But before we get to that, my name is Collin. I'm one of the worship leaders here at the Bridge. But this week, they gave me the fancy little mic, and I'm very, very excited because I love the book of Jonah. I did a whole deep dive on the book through resources from the Bible Project, from guys like Tim Mackey, and everything that I'm going to say, not even almost everything, basically everything I'm going to say to you today, I got from them. So credit where credit is due. They do amazing work. They really brought the story of Jonah to life for me. Jonah is short, that's great. Jonah is strange, and it is wonderful. It is much, much more interesting than you may think, because most of us have encountered this story before, and probably as children. It might actually be one of the more familiar Bible stories because of stuff like this. Do we have the picture up there? Well, we'll have it in post. Oh yeah, there it is. Look at this, Jonah and the whale. No hate towards the artist, but this is horrible. This is so sad. I don't like this at all. Because when we tell stories to kids, we usually simplify and edit things. That's a normal thing. A lot of the times we get rid of the tricky parts of the story in order to have a simple, applicable, kid-friendly moral. Something like, you should share with your sister, right? So Jonah, or it'll be like, Jonah didn't obey God, so he got swallowed by a fish. So you should obey your parents. Or I don't know what'll happen. But you should obey your parents. You should be nice. But come on, guys. This story is thousands of years old. This is a scroll that we have from this ancient culture. And if that's what we get out of it, we are completely wasting it. It is beautiful. It's filled with poetry. It's very sophisticated. It's funny. It's challenging, and it's even disturbing. It is a story that I am convinced is meant for grown-ups, and that we have to approach as grown-ups if we want to respect and get what we should out of the story. One last thing. My friend Jeb, he said this last Sunday. It was so perfect. He said he was taught the story as Jonah and the whale. And the two main characters of Jonah and the whale, obviously, are Jonah and the whale. But I hope that we get through it today to where we can realize that the story has a lot more than just the fish, right? Because surprise, surprise, the main character of Jonah is actually Jonah and God, or maybe I should say you and God. So let's jump right in. Jonah is a rebellious, religious hypocrite. He runs from his own God. His sin and selfishness turn him into a relational wrecking ball. The sin in his life spills into the lives of all the people around him. We talked about this last week. And he is so numb to God, he is so numb to the world around him that he doesn't even see what he's doing. He doesn't even see how it's affecting the people. And last time we were with him, he got thrown off the boat into the raging sea. And if Jonah was a one-chapter story, that would be a pretty conclusive ending. And so he died, right? Scuba diving, submarines, that's a recent thing. In biblical times, if you fall into the ocean, especially during a storm, you're dead. If you're consumed by the chaos, you're lost forever, taken by the sea. We're supposed to think, bummer, what a horrible way to die. But the good news, guys, is that the story doesn't end there. It takes a twist. Jonah has this encounter with his own death. He literally and figuratively looks down the mouth of death as it swallows him up. And we the audience, are thinking, Jonah is getting what he deserved. He's getting what's coming to him. God is allowing him to face the consequences of his own actions. Jonah hits rock bottom as he's swallowed up by the mess that he made. But we catch a glimpse of something wonderful, something better than getting what we deserve, an echo of the gospel. Because the God of Israel turns the vehicle of death into this bizarre, instrument of grace that gives Jonah a second chance at life, that gives him this opportunity to open his eyes. So we'll pick up at the very end of chapter 1, verse 17, and we will read, "And the Lord appointed a great fish to swallow up Jonah. And Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. And from inside the fish, Jonah is not dead. What is he doing? He is composing beautifully intricate Hebrew poetry to represent his prayer to God." Now, if that sounds strange to you, that means you're paying attention. Good job. This is bizarre. It's meant to be funny. So let's wake ourselves up. Let's use our imagination. You are inside a living creature from the depths. You're surrounded by seawater, fish bones, and squid beaks. The oxygen situation is not great. The smell would be overwhelming. You feel the stomach contracting around you. There is no room. Stomach acid is eating away at you slowly, but undeniably, you are being digested. It is pitch black for 3 whole days and 3 whole nights. And Jonah is there in this hell, and he is going, "Oh Lord, my God, how many are..." What rhymes with seaweed? It's over the top. It's bizarre, just like everything in the book of Jonah. You know, it's cranked up to 11. It's pure drama. So let's embrace the bizarreness. Let's embrace the weirdness, but let's back up and ask ourselves, what's happening? Why is the story of Jonah like this? What are we supposed to get out of this? This prayer, the story in general, the fish? What are we missing? So I want to tackle 2 things. The first being, what is the meaning of Jonah in its biblical and ancient setting? And then we will get into what it says to us here today. My big main point that I'm going to start out with is one that I think we can all agree with. It is, say it with me, reading the Bible is hard. Reading the Bible is hard. This book, it's beautiful and it's wonderful, but it is so old and it is so strange. It is written in genres from at least 2,000 years ago. 2,000 is on the newer side. So if you are a normal person, maybe there are some scholars here, but if you are a normal person, you do not read a ton of ancient Near Eastern literature. The Bible's probably it. So you might end up in a situation that I've been in. So I'm reading the Bible, I'm doing my daily devos. I'm reading about Daniel in the lion's den. Daniel, he's in the lion's den. He's faithful to God. He prays when he's supposed to, and he resists the evil king, and it's great. And so far, so good. And then I turn the page, and there's a vision with a leopard with 4 wings and 4 heads. And suddenly, I'm outside of the Bible story. I'm outside of the familiar, and I'm just facing this weirdness. And so I close my Bible, and I go, okay, time for lunch. And I walk away with nothing. It'd be like this. This is a silly example I'll start with. But my friend Brendan, he loves the Fast and the Furious movies, the whole series. He's seen them all. He has very strong opinions about all of them. He's probably watching this now. Hi, Brendan. And so he wanted to get together with me. He was like, oh, let's watch some Fast and the Furious. But here's the problem, guys. He goes, oh, let's start with Fast and Furious 7. That's the best one. Let's just jump right into it. And so I go, yeah, sure. I haven't seen them. If he says we'll start with 7. We start the movie. I don't know any of the characters. I'm just thrown in the middle of this world. And sure, the cars are cool, but the story-wise, I'm missing all the references. I don't know any of their names. And by the time we get to the dramatic, tragic, the emotional send-off at the end of the movie, if you guys know it, you know it. Like, it doesn't hit me like it's supposed to. Why? Because I missed 6 whole Fast and Furious episodes, right? And the stakes for this get way higher when we do the same thing with the Bible. If we read the story of this rebellious Israelite getting swallowed up and vomited out, like there are no other parts of the Bible, it loses so much of what it's aiming to do. Because the Bible is constantly in conversation with itself. The Bible is constantly referencing other parts of the Bible. So sometimes we get really zoomed in, and we forget that what we're reading is part of not just one book, but a long series of books, a collection of books that are unified in the fact that they are a story that leads to Jesus. That's the spoiler at the end. We'll get to that there. But once we jump into it, if we want to dig into that ancient context, the good news is this, guys. Jonah isn't hiding it. If you know how to look for it, there are big signs that point us in the right direction. So let's start with genre. Genre is a really great thing to help us. And where can we look for a clue for the genre? Let's try chapter 1, verse 1. Now the word of the Lord came to Jonah, the son of Amittai. Now, if you grew up in church, you probably know this. What kind of people does the word of the Lord come to? Prophets. That's right. Good job. I hope you said it. I hope you did. But are you guys okay? Yeah. Jonah is one of the books of the prophets. And that's the main context that really helps us to understand how to read it. If you've ever read the prophets, there is a lot going on. But the basic storyline is really simple. It's the story of Israel. God redeems his people out of slavery, out of Egypt. He brings them into a relationship with him, a covenant relationship with himself. And he gives them gifts in his instructions, his Torah, about how to live as a holy witness to the whole world, to all the nations. And guys, how do they do? Not great. The people of Israel abandon Yahweh. They chase after, I'm being silly, guys, sorry, wait. They chase after other gods. They idolize things like military power, wealth, and it leads them to injustice and sin and faithlessness to Yahweh. But here is where the prophets come in. So the prophets come onto the scene, and this is what they're about. They accuse Israel of their sin and faithlessness. They warn Israel that if they don't turn from their ways, they will deal with the consequences of their actions, which ultimately takes the form of the big bad empire of Babylon, sweeping over and destroying Jerusalem, hauling off the Israelites into exile. That is a huge theme of the prophets. And here's what you did. Here's what will happen because of that. And finally, Yahweh's commitment to his promises is even stronger than Israel's rebellion and sin. So three main parts. Number one is the rebellion of God's people. Rebellion of God's people. That's part one of what the prophets are interested in doing. Then we have part two, consequences for actions. And a lot of times this will be a warning. The prophets will say, hey guys, these are the specific sins, and here are going to be the natural consequences of what you guys did. But the best part, don't miss this, is the promise of restoration. I hope you guys can see that at home. Yeah. But there's this promise, like I was saying, that last part's my favorite one. There's this promise where God will preserve his people and bring them through to the other side. Jonah occurs among the prophets. So this core message, this story about rebellious people who abandon their God, but God's grace brings them out to the other side. If you're paying attention, you're probably seeing the rough shape of the story of Jonah, right? The rebellion, the consequences in the storm, and the promise of restoration, the delivery through the fish. And it's the same story, right? The other prophetic books are words about this. They're writings about this, the script. But Jonah is a story. It is a narrative that communicates the same thing. God has given us a gift in that if this one way of communicating this message didn't quite click, he comes at you with another strategy in his generosity. Each of the prophets writes a little bit differently about the same core message, but they are all writing in the same conversation. And as they do, together they develop metaphors. They use the same symbols. So Hosea, who's actually one of the first prophets to write out of all of them, he came up with a ton of great poetic symbols to talk about Israel, to talk about this three-part story, right? We see an example in Hosea chapter 8. You'll see right away what's going on. You'll see Jonah almost immediately. It goes, "My people have broken the covenant that I made with them. They have refused to obey my law. Israel shouts to me, 'We recognize you as our God,' but they have turned away from what is good. So an enemy will chase them. My people will appoint kings I do not want. They choose princes without my permission. They use their silver and gold to make statues of gods. That is how they destroy themselves." Now, does that sound like anyone in Jonah so far? I'll give you a hint. It's not the fish. So what's going to be the result of this? He gives examples of their sin, the choosing princes without God's permission, the making idols. What's coming? So Israel is swallowed up. Now they are among the nations, like something no one wants. They have sold themselves to the nations. I will now gather them. They will begin to waste away under the oppression of a mighty king. So Hosea is one of the earliest prophets, but lots of the other prophets pick up on his ideas. One of the clearest examples of that is Jeremiah. He writes this describing Babylon coming to town, Babylon, the big bad empire. And he writes, "Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, has devoured us. He has thrown us into confusion. He has made us like an empty jar. Like a sea monster, he has swallowed us and filled his stomach with our precious things. And then he has spewed us out." It's Jonah, right? We're seeing it, right? Now the prophets, they're not the only ones who speak like this. In the Psalms, it's written like this: "If the Lord had not been on our side when people attacked us, they would have swallowed us alive. When their anger flared against us, the flood would have engulfed us. The torrent would have swept over us. The raging waters would have swept us away." That's Psalm 124, right? And among the prophets and the poets of the Old Testament, the common way to describe Israel's sin and the exile is the idea of being drowned in a flood, or the idea of being swallowed by a sea creature. So the book of Jonah, right, what we're focusing on, it comes along and it turns this motif, it turns this poetic idea into a narrative story, into a story about how one Israelite actually lived out the whole poetic motif, right? The author knows what he's doing. The image of being trapped. The Israelites would have seen themselves in the story. And I hope that by going through all that, by seeing that thematic line that's all throughout Scripture, that fish makes a little bit more sense, that it doesn't come out of nowhere, because it would have clicked with the original readers, right? So let's back up before we get to the belly of the fish. Jonah is resisting God. He's running away, and he is quite proud of himself. Running away from Yahweh, breeze going through his hair. He's declared his autonomy from God. He's going to do what he thinks is right instead. And then all of a sudden, it catches up with him. His selfishness, his bad decisions, it brings him down deep. Down, down, down he goes, and eventually he hits the bottom, the pit, the belly of the beast. And that brings us to our own lives, right? In the belly of the beast, we see a picture of the seasons of hardship that we go through, the seasons of pain, the confusion. In Jonah's case, it was his own fault. For some of us, that's pretty similar. We're in a mess, and it's us. We're the ones who did it. Now what? What do you do when you're there? How do you pray from the pit? This whole chapter 2 that we're going to read, it's a chance for us to see Jesus pray through his suffering. Now, he's there because of his own decisions. He can't really blame anyone. But sometimes God's people end up in the belly of the beast, and it's not because of their own decisions. Just think of one example, Daniel. Daniel's a stand-up guy. He's a great dude. Yet he ends up exiled in Babylon because of the decisions his parents made. That's just a reality, right? And what does he do with that? What do we do with that? How do we pray when someone else's sin gets us swallowed up by a fish we didn't even bring into the picture, right? And what if there's no one to blame? What if it's just part of the brokenness of this world? It's just a tragedy, right? In this prayer, I see a gift to help us think about all of those things. So I encourage you, I should say, to put on this prayer like a pair of glasses. Look at your own story, where you are today through it. Use this prayer to think about your own relationship with God. All right, if you guys are with me, let's meet Jonah down in the depths. Jonah goes, "In my distress, I called out to the Lord, and he answered me. From deep in the realm of the dead, I called for help, and you listened to my cry." The first thing that this hardship causes, this beast causes for him, is to cry out for help. Now stop and think. Can you think of any moment in your life where you literally had to cry out for help in a moment of danger? If you've ever been in that moment where it's just out of your control, there's no shame. You just do it. It's instinctual. For me, my mind immediately goes to experience I had of nearly drowning, just like Jonah, I should say. But I was only 3 years old at the time, so I don't really remember it directly. This is mostly what I've pieced together from stories of people around me, right? But we were at the pool together as a family, and I had my floaties on. But I was annoyed by it, right? I saw the cool kids, I saw the big kids, that they could all swim without their floaties. I saw my sister, and it looked awesome. So, in my 3-year-old wisdom, I walk over to the deep end of the pool, I take my floaties off, and I jump in. Now, immediately, I start flailing and sinking, and I would have died. But my dad jumped in the pool, and he saved me, right? Before I was rescued, I encountered that reality of drowning. And in that moment, the desire that I had, I don't know, I'm just guessing at my mind, but the desire that I had to be that big kid before I was ready to show everybody that, no, I can do this on my own, that disappeared immediately, completely. In that rock bottom moment, our pride can finally break and we can cry out, "Help me, Father, help me," right? And that's what happens with Jonah. Hardship brings him to the place where he can finally cry out to God. And notice this. If we remember from chapter 1, everybody else on the boat in the storm was praying except Jonah. Jonah was asleep under the boat. Don't miss the irony. Jonah is a literal prophet of Yahweh. He worships the true God, and yet all of these pagan sailors are doing a much better job of being pious. They're actually doing it. And even in that scene, the captain wakes him up and he goes, "Jonah, you should pray. Look, we're all going to die here. What are you doing asleep?" And Jonah doesn't even pray. We don't see a prayer from him there. They just draw lots. And Jonah's solution before he prays is, "Chuck me into the ocean." His prayer is legitimately a last resort. But God doesn't give up on him. He's willing to bring him to that moment. And oh my gosh, if that's what it took for Jonah to pray, to have a conversation with God, God was willing to do that. And don't miss the simplicity in Jonah's prayer. When he goes, "I cried out to the Lord," and the comfort that Jonah has is he listens to my cry. In hardships, so often we are tempted to feel that God is absent or that he does not hear or care about what we are going through. Now, Jonah is arguably in the worst situation imaginable, like in the belly of the beast, and he draws exactly the opposite conclusion. God meets him there at the bottom. Verse 3, let's pick it up. He goes, "You hurled me into the depths, into the very heart of the seas, and the currents swirled about me. All your waves and breakers swept over me." The experience heightens Jonah's awareness of God's presence. Whose waves are crashing over him? God's. Who threw him into the sea? I thought the sailors threw him into the sea. That's what it said in chapter 1. Well, what does Jonah see in that circumstance? Yahweh, God. This is a hard pill to swallow. But the circumstances that brought him to the bottom are precisely where he sees God's involvement. Now, who is ultimately responsible for Jonah's mess? Is it God's fault? Is it on God that Jonah made stupid decisions? No. And what about people who end up in a pit, who end up in the belly of the beast because of other people's sins? Like Joseph. He gets sold as a slave into Egypt because of his brothers. God uses that for good. But is God responsible for their sin? No, that's on them. But don't miss this. Jonah sees that whatever sin, whether his own or others, whatever sin brings him to that place of death, that God is not biting his fingernails. God is not surprised. In fact, there may be times when God brings us into hardship intentionally for his purpose. God sometimes gives us what we might call a severe mercy. A severe mercy. And in Jonah's case, it's very severe. How much worse can it be than being swallowed up by this monster of the deep, right? And here's what's tough too. Most of us as human beings have this default assumption that we invite God into our lives to give us safe passage to our chosen destinations. One-way ticket to Tarshish, right? So stories like Jonah, stories like Job, stories like Abraham really disturb us because if your idea of God is that his priority is to make us safe, comfortable, and happy, let me save you some effort. It's much simpler, just be an atheist, because that God is not our God Yahweh. And your whole life will expose how brittle that view of God is. It will break away. Because in the scriptures, God's priority is simple. It's to call people to himself and to transform them so that we understand who we are meant to be. And finally, here's the great realization we all need to come to discover once and for all that we are not God. We are horrible at being the captain of our own ship. We set sail to whatever looks good in our own eyes, and in God's severe mercy, he just might wreck our ship. Now, we might hate him for it. But the paradox is that it might be the best thing that ever happens to us. We could discover how broken and selfish we are, how blind we were to it, how much we take for granted. And oh my gosh, the fruit that can really come from it is humility. Now, hear this, guys. I don't know your story, but I know that some of you have been through a lot. Maybe much, much more than I can ever imagine. So as I'm speaking this, please don't hear, I don't want to take your suffering lightly. I take that very seriously. And I don't speak on my own authority. I just say this because the spirit, the message of the scriptures is clear. And it's good news that there is no sin of my own or anyone else's that is beyond God's redemptive reach. And his highest priority is to free you from yourself and to draw you to himself. And guys, that means he might throw you overboard. Let's pick up in verse 4, right? He says, I have been banished from your sight, yet I will look again toward your holy temple. This is exile language. This is back here, right? This is that story that I thought for a second that I had gotten what I really wanted. I rebelled, and the consequences of my own actions are revealed. I thought what I wanted was to be away from the presence of God, and he sees where it lands him. Boom, consequences. And he got what he wanted, that distance, right? And it's horrible. He goes even more into depth. In verse 5, he goes, the engulfing waters threatened me. The deep surrounded me. Seaweed was wrapped around my head. To the roots of the mountains I sank down. The earth beneath barred me in forever. But you, Lord my God, brought my life up from the pit. Guys, down in the sea, down in the earth, down into the pit, the metaphors he's using, it seems hopeless, it seems lost, but then at the very last minute, there's that twist of grace, that Jesus movie. And he says in verse 7, he says, when my life was ebbing away, I remembered you, O Lord, and my prayer rose to you, to your holy temple. Jonah realizes that the only thing he has going for him is that God is committed to redeeming him. God knew who Jonah was when he called him. He wasn't surprised by Jonah's disobedience. God chose him, I believe, because he knew Jonah had this heart problem. He knew there was this disobedience at his heart. And this was the great physician's way of doing heart surgery on his reluctant prophet. And at the brink of death, Jonah recalls all the gifts, all the goodness that Yahweh has shown him, the things he ignored before. And so, incredibly, he ends with gratitude. He sings a song of gratitude. And where is he? Where has he not left? This is the paradox. When we discover that God is the only hope that we have, all of the sudden, our life is no longer our own anymore. That priority of our own comfort, of our own happiness, it's lost, and the joy of the Lord can take over, right? He looks to the temple, the place where sacrifices were offered for forgiveness, the hot spot of God's presence. That's his hope. He looks to there. Now, as Christians today, come on, here we go. Who was the ultimate sacrifice for our forgiveness? And who is the ultimate hot spot for God's presence? Come on, say it with me. It's Jesus. And we look to him to remember who God is. Even in the belly of the beast, we look to the holy hill where that cross was. And that's where we find our peace. That's where we find our joy. That's where we find our source of gratitude. And guys, what we naturally want to do is we want to look at our circumstances and our feelings as an indicator of God's commitment to us. We look at our circumstances, our feelings, as an indicator of God's love. But Jonah here says the opposite. He says his circumstances are not a reliable indicator of God's feelings, nor his commitment to him. We as Christians look to one place, the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. He is our hope as people who have realized that we are living in the belly of the beast. We are living in exile. And when we come to that realization, we're able to worship wherever we go. And this is how Jonah ends. He goes, those who cling to worthless idols turn away from God's love for them. But I, with shouts of grateful praise, will sacrifice to you. I will worship. That's what he's saying he will do. What I have vowed, I will make good. I will say, salvation comes from the Lord. Christ can save and restore you. And some of us need to repent to God today, right now. And I implore you, do not wait. He is there eagerly waiting for you. Just cry out to him. He is listening. Verse 10, and God commanded the fish, and it vomited Jonah onto the dry land. That's the happy ending. Blech, out onto the beach. And guys, there's one last little tidbit I want to give you that I just think is so funny. I just wanted to give it as a last little detail. In the story, in Hebrew, certain words can be gendered. It's a bit like Spanish where you have gato or gata. If it's a boy cat, you say gato. If it's a girl cat, you say gata, right? Hebrew is the same way. The word fish that is used is mostly the word for boy fish. We see, God appointed a fish. He appointed a dog. That's the Hebrew word, a dog, right? But when Jonah is in the belly of the whale, the fish, right? The fish is referred to as daga. That is a female fish. What's going on? Did the author forget what was going on? No, it's a joke. Like, what kind of thing normally has a human being inside it? A mama. So The author here it's a very, very old joke, thousands and thousands of years joke. It's saying like the mama fish. And it's not just a joke, it's a symbol of Jonah's rebirth. When he is vomited out, he is a man who was dead who can now live again. And that's all of us who have encountered the love of Jesus. I hope that you guys walked away with something. I'm very grateful. Thank you for hearing me out and all my silliness. The book of Jonah is really beautiful. I encourage you to keep digging into it. God's scriptures are an incredible gift. So let's close in prayer together. Lord God, thank you for your holy word. Thank you for that promise of restoration and peace, God. Thank you that even in our rebellion, you don't leave us there, God. You don't just abandon us to the consequences of our actions, God, that when we cry out for help, God, that you are rich in mercy, that you are quick to forgive, that you are slow to anger, Lord. Your word is so good. Your hope is so good, and we look to your holy hill for our peace. In your holy name, amen.